Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
So, I have right off the bat, I have a confession to make, and that is I have gone over this material, and I'm not sure that this particular little section of Torah Temimah, where he himself is discussing various elements, whether I've been able to really understand and comprehend what he's trying to say. But we will plunge in and we will do the best. I'll do the best I can, and we'll see. So here we go. And we're actually right. Let's see. Make sure I've got the right place. Okay. So we're actually looking at this statement. We're in the situation where the angels are about to rescue Lot, his wife and his daughters, and they're telling him he has to get out, he has to escape ASAP. And here's his response. Vayomer Lot Alehem, Lot said to them, Al na Adonai, please, O Lord, Hine matzah Avdecha chen be'enecha, behold, your servant has found favor in your eyes, Mategadel chastecha, and you are enlarging the kindness asher asita madi, which you have already done for me, lachayot et nafshi, to allow me to live, right, to cause me to live, v'anachi lo uchal lehimalet hahara, but I am not able to escape to the mountain, Pentidbakani hara'a vamati, lest the evil cling to me and I die. Okay, so let's take a look at the Torah Temimah on that. So, before we do that, I want to go back and see, here's the Adonai, there's that little circle, and it refers to this here where it says Kadosh. In other words, this is, O Lord, capital L. So it does not mean my lords, which you might think, right? It says Lot said to them, and you might have thought it meant, please, my lords, referring that he was speaking to the angels. But what this is telling us is that from the Masoretic text point of view and the traditional point of view, he actually is speaking to God. So this already, of course, is a little bit on the confusing side. So here we go. Right. Alna Adonai. So he says, Kol Hashemot Ha'omarim Balot. All the divine names, that is, wherever it talks about God in some reference to God, Chol. He is referring to, in other words, or Shemot can also be nouns. So it means that where this noun is used, Chol, it is not holy, it is whole, right? Chutz mizeh, with this one exception. In other words, all his speech essentially is unsanctified, except here. Vayomer elna Adonai, where he says, do not please, O Lord. Let's see if there's any more here. Behold, your servant has found favor in your eyes, lachayot et nafshi, to allow me to live. And so the reason why we deduce that is a reference to God, that Adonai there. He'd have to be talking to somebody for whom it was possible to keep alive or to kill. And Zo HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that would have to refer to the Holy One, blessed be He. Okay. So let's take a look. I'll take it from the top. Okay, so the first little part, right? We notice that there is a comment here, Zion, right here, Zion. Upiresh Rashi, and Rashi explains the Hachikamar. This is what he meant. In other words, or this is what Rashi says. Vayomer Lot Alehem. When it says Vayomer Alot Alehem, it means Lot said to them, right? But Osnehem. So he said this to the angels. In other words, that's that he spoke in their, either it could be in their presence, in their hearing, Osnehem, was in his ear, right? But I think it goes on to say, Al na yehichen, let this not be so. So in other words, what Lot said to the angels is, let this not be so. V'chazar, and then he turned klapei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, towards the Holy One, blessed be He, v'amar Adonai, and then he said, Lord. So let's take a look quickly before we go back to this. I want to look at this sentence here in the text, right? Right. So, in other words, vayomer lot alahem. That's what he said to them. Okay, but alahem. He said no. Lot said to them, "I'll not." No. And then he said Adonai, and then he turned and he faced God and he says, Lord. And presumably what follows, he said to God. Let's find the place again. Okay, let's see. Yeah, right. V'chazar kapet v'amar Adonai. Hine ma'amatzati matzah avdachachin b'necha. So this is what he said to God. Behold, your servant has found favor in your eyes. Adkan l'shano. That is quoting Rashi. So this is the quote from Rashi, how Rashi breaks up that verse to make it possible to understand it that way. The Kesef Mishneh, and the Kesef Mishneh, that's a commentary on Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, right? Sof Perek Zayin, Perek Vav, at the end of chapter 6, Miyesodei HaTorah, on the foundations of Torah. So in Maimonides, we're referring here to Maimonides' code of Jewish law, his Mishnah Torah, and one of the commentaries, major commentaries, is called the Kesef Mishneh, and we're referencing to that section of the code that's called Yesodei HaTorah, the fundamentals of Torah. At the end of chapter 6 here, Piresh, B'Shem HaRashba, he explains in the name of the Rashba, Rabban Shimon ben Adret. He's one of the commentators on the Mishnah Torah. Excuse me. Ashod vayomer alehem, right? That where it says vayomer alehem, that where Lot said he said to them, Heve kamo bifnehem. That all what it means, it doesn't mean he said it to them. It just means he said in their presence, right? So in other words, when he turned to God and addressed God, he was doing that in the presence of the angels. The angels saw him doing and heard him doing what he was doing. Maharsha, okay, so and this is the Maharsha, I believe it's Shlomo Idels, and he is a major commentator found in the back of the Vilna Shas, of the Vilna Gemara. Hiksha al halashon, right? The Maharsha has a problem, right? He raised an objection al halashon kol hashemot ha'amurim, where it says, and it's what we said before, all those names that are stated, b'chule, right? That they were all they were not referencing to God. They were just kol. They were regular words, non-sanctified words. And he raised an objection to that statement, etc. Halo matzinu shem Adonai balot, right? Because the truth is that if we see the noun Adonai with Lot, sheyeh chol ki im echad, right? So I think this is where I'm starting to have difficulties in terms of exactly what he's saying. Is he saying that if we look at this word Adonai, right, regarding Lot, that there's no reference that Lot uses the word Adonai? And by the way, the word Shem can often refer to the noun used to describe God, referencing God specifically. And so it could mean that we do not find that Lot says this word of Adonai that is secular, ki im echad, so except in one case. That's what this looks like to me, right? So here we go. And where's that where Adonai, where he does use it? So there's only one other time when he uses the word Adonai, and it means it's not, he's referring there to the angels back in verse 2. If we go back to verse 2, the beginning of this chapter, and he refers to them as Adonai, and there he is talking about my lords, referencing the angel. And that's the only other place. So to say, we never find Lot using the words for God in a holy manner, except here, in this case that we're looking at in our verse here. If there's only one other time when he uses it, if that's in fact what the Maharsha is pointing out. And this is Pasuk Bet, in other words, verse 2. If you go back to verse 2. Ukvar kadmu b'ha'ara'azo, but Rashba. He says the Rashba already anticipated this particular note. Kesef Mishneh Sham. I think that's what it's saying. Remember, we made a reference to the Kesef Mishneh, and the Kesef Mishneh quotes him or something, but tirates, right? And he explains, and again, this I looked at the translation of this, Derihita Delishnahu, that we're talking about the flow of the language. Now, exactly what does he mean by the flow of the language? Is he talking about the fact that we can tell that in that first case, he's not referring to God, he's only referring to the angels by the context and the flow of the language there, right? And that could be that in that particular case, he's saying it, and there's a reason why. Because look at what is written above, Beresh Parsha, at the beginning of this Parsha vaYera, the Pasuk in the verse, Yukachna Ma'at Mayim, where he tells, this is now talking about Abraham and the angels, and he says, let a little water be taken, Dugma the Divrei Rashba, an example to the words of the Rashba, in this particular case. Now, exactly, I went back there, I looked it over, I didn't find anything that really clarified what was going on. But what I did discover is that, let's see if I can find that place for you in verse 2. Let's see if I can find it. I'm going to have to go back a little bit. Let's see. Okay, we're almost there. Almost there. Here we go. Should be finding it in a second. Okay. Yeah, Yukach Nama Atmayim, right? There it is. That's the verse he's referring to now. Let's see what he says. Let's see. That's not it there. And okay. These are his commentaries on Yukach Nama Atmayim. Okay. Okay. So Tana de Rabbi Ishmael Mischal. This is talking about 3 and 3, etc. We're talking about bread. We had this, of course, we did this, and we're talking about this, but that does not seem to be talking about the issue. Now, here we go. Now, this is the reference to the Maharsha. I found it, right? The Hiksha Maharsha. So let's just go back here, and just the beginning of it says, Yein Betanitet, look at Tractate Tanit, page 9a. Amar Rabbi Yossi Bar Rabbi Yehuda, said Rabbi Yossi in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, Be'er Nitan Israel, that the well, that is Miriam's well, remember, you may recollect this particular passage that we were reading, right? That the Israelites had, in other words, that they always had water while they were wandering through the desert. Zchut Miriam, that was in the merit of Miriam, etc. The Hiksha Maharsha. Now, once again, we've got the Maharsha raised an objection, Sham. Why? Hakan mevu'ah Avraham od zachal. That here we actually see that Abraham was the one who saw to it. Okay. So Rabbi Yossi says it was on account of Miriam, and we see here in the passage that it was because Abraham offered the water for them to wash their legs, right? They had already done something for which the Israelites later on merited this well, right? And what he wrote to try and harmonize this, Dvarav dechukim. He says, this is a Torah Temimah saying that his words are forced. And he says, apparently there's still another reference in the Parsha of Chukat, which is where I think we read about the death of Aaron and Miriam and how they needed the water. Excuse me, so sorry. Let's see what I can get. V'nir'eh lomar, right? And it would appear that makes sense. The hakavana zachu levaYera shel Miriam, right? That when he says they merited, in other words, the subsequent generation merited to have Miriam's well, shezachu le Miriam shebishvila zachu levaer, that they merited to have Miriam because on her account they received the well. V'kitzur lashonhu. So he says it's that when the Gemara says that they merited the well on account of Miriam, it's speaking in an abbreviated kind of way. Ukahai gavna tzarich lefaresh makatuv, right? So this is in a similar way. We're going to have to explain what is written bischar chema on account of the merit of the butter, v'chalav, and the milk, zachula aman. They merited getting the manna. Okay, let's see. I'm trying to say. Okay, I'm looking to see here if there's anything helpful here. Okay, so does this really give us a clue as to what's going on here? I must admit I'm somewhat at a loss. So now I'm back in the passage we were looking at. Let me find it. Okay. So let me find the flow of the language. So that's all this is. So the Rashba trying to say that the what says in the Gemara, etc. We have to be careful and exactly, to go over all the various parts of this particular section here. It takes time to go over it, etc. Now, I will tell you that back in verse 2, where Abraham also says Adonai, that also is a word that's a reference to God and not to them, not to the angels as my Lord. So that was sort of interesting to find out there. So I think that the Maharsha is possibly objecting here to Rashi's explanation. I'm not certain, right? That somehow how he understands this term flow of the language, I'm not absolutely certain. Okay, going to a new passage. Let's take a look at this. Okay. Interesting value. So here we go. So what does Lot say? Let's go take a look. This is the verse we just read. Hinena ha'ir hazot. Behold, there is this city, Krova lanus shama. It's near to flee there. Vehi mitzar, and it's small. Imaltana, let me flee there. Let me escape there. Shama there. Halo mitzar. Behold, it is so small. Vatachi nafshi, that I can live, that I can survive. So here we go. Prova. Amar Rav Chama Bar Guria Amar Rav. Said Rav Chama Bar Guria in the name of Rav. Le'olam yachazor Adam le'shev be'ir she'yishivata krova. That a person should make every attempt to live in a newly populated town. That is something for someone to consider. To live in a newly populated town. Why? Shenivnata v'nityashva ze lokvar, right? That it just was really, he's saying here, that it was built and populated in recently. Klomar ir chadasha. In other words, a new town. Try and live in a new town. Okay. Let's go on. Let's see here. Okay. Oh, sorry, I skipped this. So let me go back to here. Pen tidapkani ara. Lest the evil cling to me. Ein haba'al motzi et ishto ba'al korcha minave lenave. It is a husband should not have his wife move from one dwelling to another dwelling, from one home to another home. Right, against her will, that he needs to make sure that his wife accepts the fact that they're going to live in a new home. He needs to make sure she's on the same page. And even from a dwelling that isn't so good, a bad dwelling, the naveh hayafa, to a beautiful dwelling. Doesn't matter, even if it's from one that's ugly to one that's gorgeous. Mipnei shehanaveh hayafeh bodek. So I think, okay, because it means I think this means God examines the person who is going into a beautiful dwelling. Dichtiv, so we see here, Pentedapkani hara'a vamati, lest the evil cling to me and I die. And I think in that context, we have to be thinking that how the Yerushalmi, because that's what this is from, the Talmud Yerushalmi in Ketubot, chapter 13, halacha 10, that what he's saying is that Lot was going to be going from evil dwelling to a beautiful dwelling. The Torah Temimah is going to explain in what sense you might say that. But remember how he's saying that the context of his saying, lest the evil overtake me, is that he's being judged. He's going to be judged by God, and that possibly he's going to be found wanting, etc. So there's this interesting connection that the Gemara is making, that the rabbis are making from a literary perspective on looking at these words very carefully. So let's take a look at Torah Temimah. Kloma, that is to say, afilu hanaveh hayafe boduk. That is to say, even in a case of a beautiful dwelling, he examines. When you make a change, you are examined. Okay? And even if you're going into a beautiful dwelling, v'hainu, that is to say, shebotek et haguf, that he examines the body, lemi sheba minave lenave, that one is that the person's body is examined if he moves from one habitation, from one home to another home. Umipnei chaf, and in having that happen, chalaim ba'im, it's possible there'll be illness. So the tradition understands that there's a connection between our behavior and our physical well-being. So just sharing this for whatever it means. And that is even if he's going from a bad dwelling to a good dwelling, Lot. And so here we have the case of Lot, where he'd be going from a bad dwelling to a good dwelling. How? Shaya Shochen b'Sodom, because he was living in Sodom, Ba'emek, right? And in a valley. That's where Sodom was. Malachim amru lo, and the angels were telling him, La Lot Bahar, to go up onto the mountain, Shehu Nafeh Yafeh, because that's a pleasant area to live up on the mountain. Why? The Avir Har, because the air in on a mountain or on a hill, Tov Me Avir Emek, it's better than the air in a valley. And despite the fact they told him to do that, Sirev Atzmo, right? He was hesitant. He didn't want to do it. Shechashash lesakana. Why? Because he was concerned about danger, Nishinui Veset, from the fact that he was making a change from one situation or one familiar situation to a non-familiar situation. Right. V'dinze, and this particular law, Huva Gamba Bavli, this is also mentioned in the Babylonian Talmud. The one he quoted was from the Yerushalmi, Sof Ketuvot, at the end of Tractate Ketuvot, page 110b. And here, Rak Belo Hasmichut al Pasuk Zeh Shelefanenu. But that particular passage in the Gemara there doesn't bring this verse that we're looking at and making it depend on that halacha depends on this verse. It's based on this verse. Ubesefer, I think this is Ravid Hazahav, something like that. I didn't have a chance to check the abbreviation, right? Katav, he wrote, the Efshar, that it's possible, Yesh Lomar, one could say, Shamileh Bodek Shabbat, that this word Bodek, to examine, that's in the Gemara, he misurasa, that in fact it's jumbled up. The words here are jumbled, the letters here are jumbled up, but Tzarich Lomar Dovek, right? So instead of saying Bodek, right, to examine, it should be Dovek, which means it clings to. Well, the fiza, and if we understand that particular interpretation that there's a word here that's gotten jumbled up, and we understand it as dovek, yitechonen haraya. In that case, the proof is established, milashon pasuk, right? Then it makes sense because the verse itself says pen tedakani. There it says the word dovek and tedakani, lest it clings. So that's where that particular interpretation has to do with the verse and how it's connected to the verse in that case. And with this, I'm going to stop the share. And I know this is very tough stuff. Any questions about it? Pete, I hope you have.
No.
Well, let me ask you this. Was it relatively lucid? Or was it just way too complicated?
I think these rabbis were out in the weeds.
No, maybe this rabbi is just out
No,
of the
I think
weeds.
I can't imagine what the one-on-one study session on these looked like.
Well, my honest feeling is that they were so sensitive to, and uh, we know that when you look at things through a legal lens, every turn of phrase becomes significant. And remember, for them, this was divine word, word for word, divine word. And so they would look very closely at any kind of way in which things were being said, or if there was a word there that didn't seem to be necessary, in which case the question would become, then why is it there? And the best analogy I've ever given when I was years and years ago, when I was much younger, and I was away at camp, and my wife would send me the woman who was going to become my wife would send me letters, and I'd look at those letters and I'd read them, and I'd think to myself, what did she mean by that? What's she saying by this? And I'd read them and reread them and try to, mine them for any particular nuance that they might have. And we could say that, and I know that that's not an uncommon experience, that many people can have shared that kind of experience. And for the rabbis, the Torah was a love letter from God. That's how they were looking at it.
Yep.
And so that's why they were looking at it in the way that sometimes we have more difficulty in understanding. So
Okay.
maybe that's a good place. I'll stop the recording.
Enough said.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, for sure.